Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Book for Lunch. I'm going to give you guys just announcements so you know what's coming up in the next couple of months. First of all, third Thursday is where people go and look at art stuff. This month, we've had it now. This is our third month. We'll have Bonnie Stasser come and show her oil and her photography in the meeting room, and so come and join and enjoy her art. So Book for Lunch will be December 6th, and we're going to have CCC and CHS choir. I don't know, or one together or both of them. Part of it is CCC. Randy's just making sure that if kids come, that they don't have finals. So we have to kind of work within their final schedule. So I just put them both up there. So we'll do that, and we'll have some new Christmas books out on the table, have a nice lunch, and that'll be December 6th. Okay. And then Book for Lunch in January will not be the first Wednesday because, of course, that's like the 3rd. So January 10th, we will have Rick Austin come and speak on Paper Cuts by Ellery Adams. And that will be at noon, of course. And then in February, we have Linda Garrett. Linda, would you like to just raise your hand? She's read the books by Ben Carson, You Have a Brain and Creative Equal. And so she's going to talk about those books. And when she gets a book and she's enthusiastic about a subject in a book, you know it'll be a good program. So that'll be February the 7th. I don't have anything for March yet or April because I'm kind of waiting on dates for other events and things with friends, so I'm kind of holding on. But and then remember, up until just before that Thanksgiving, the 15th next week, story time. If you have grandkids or little ones come to your house and want to do something, Judy's always welcoming little ones to come to story time. You know, spur of the moment. You don't have to have a reservation. And then, of course, our Play with Purpose continues through November 16th. You do have to have that, but I like people to know what it is. Kind of a Montessori learning thing, and you does it, and it's great for parents, it's great for the kids, and their little wonderful family. I should have her do a program just on that alone. And then, of course, our Youth Activity Center is open from 3:30 to 5:30. We have a youth that's age 9 to 15. They can come and use the basement. When there's no school days, we will be open 1 to 5. And so if they're visiting you on holidays, you might look. We will not be available on Thursday after Thanksgiving. We're both during Christmas break and stuff. And then we have a ESL class Thursday evenings at 6:30, and then we also have a Spanish English class at 10:15 in the morning on Mondays. So that's new. And remember, as storms come, that if you need to find out if we're open or closed due to weather, Facebook, our website, our Agent Verso library catalog, you can look at any of those 3 places to see if we're open. If you call, we don't normally get in to make a change in the telephone. So if it just keeps ringing, then of course we're not open. Sorry, not that high tech or whatever. We just, yeah. So, alrighty, and remember we have Sunflower E-Library or Libby, and we have audiobooks, digital books for those if you're traveling or you want to watch a movie or something. And then Hoopla, you can get books, audiobooks, your regular reading books. You can get movies, you can get cartoons, you can get all kinds of things on Hoopla. Okay, but you do have to have your library card set up for it. Okay. And then we just are so excited about being our 2022 library, Star Library for that in 2022. Don't know what's happening in 2023. Have no idea. Kind of a special thing, but we'll celebrate this year while we have it. So until then, let me welcome and let me read to you about our speaker. Okay. So today we're pleased to welcome Murl Riedel for a presentation, A New Generation of Veterans, Stories from Iraq and Afghanistan. Our program is brought to us by Humanities Kansas an independent nonprofit leading a movement of ideas to empower the people of Kansas to strengthen their communities and our democracy. Please take a moment to turn off your cell phones. I did mine, or these quiet them, so that we may enjoy the program. As we begin, let's remember that the information presented, as well as what we share and discuss, is of value and of interest. We will respect one another, even if we have different points of view. Now that we're in agreement, let's get started. So let me tell you about Murl. He's got quite a background. He works as a physical analyst and is a retired major from the Kansas Army National Guard. Prior to being a financial analyst, Murl was the director of grants at Humanities Kansas. He's an enthusiast of architecture, and since 2011 has served as a volunteer architectural surveyor with the Kansas Historical Society, which includes entering site descriptions into the Kansas Historical Resources Inventory. Please welcome Murl Riedel.
How's I think I got the mic on, if you can hear me.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Melanie. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Murl Riedel. I am a Humanities Kansas speaker, and I just want to thank the Pioneer Memorial Library for inviting me today, and I want to thank Humanities Kansas who provided funding resources to support this event today. And I got to tell you, I've been here for just maybe 20 or 15 minutes, and I've already heard stories from the people in this room that just blow my mind. I've heard stories about travels to Philippines, heard stories about a father in Oakley who bought a traveling wall to his community. I heard a story of a mother and her son who graduated West Point, all from this town. That's just incredible to me. So thank you. You know, libraries house books, but they're really made of people, really. And you guys are sort of that people. So it's really, I'm excited to be here today. So I worked as curator at the Kansas Historical Society years ago, worked as curator there. I studied American history at Kansas State University and the University of Kansas. And I'm just generally fascinated with how war impacts society and our collective memories of those conflicts. So today I'll be discussing a new generation of veterans, stories from Iraq and Afghanistan, which is part of Humanities Kansas 21st Century Civics Initiative, to lead conversations about American democracy and the shared responsibility of citizenship. Just curious, do we have any veterans in the room today? If you would raise your hand. I think we have a couple, fantastic. Anyone serve after September 11th? There again, all right. Well, thank you for being here today. Sorry. Bring this back up. Accidentally bumped a button.
Go to your PowerPoint. Go to your PowerPoint and start slides. Begin slides.
Yeah.
There you go.
All right, back on track. So here we have a picture. This is me in the picture. That's me right there. I just want to tell you a little bit about this picture. This is me and fellow lieutenants at the Radwaniya Palace complex, which is just outside of Baghdad. If you'll remember, in Iraq, when we invaded, we learned that there was a lot of palaces. The Saddam Hussein often built palaces all over the country, and they were often on high locations or in fortified places. So they actually made pretty good operating bases for the US military once we entered the country of Iraq. So we were at the Radwaniya Palace complex. You can actually see the palace up there in the background. We served with Alpha Battery, 2nd of the 130th Field Artillery, which is located in Hiawatha, Kansas. And we deployed to Iraq in 2003 as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom 2. We were the first force to arrive after the initial invasion. So Operation Iraqi Freedom was the name given to the whole operation. Operation Iraqi Freedom 1 would have been the first force that arrived. We were part of Operation Iraqi Freedom 2. And each year, as U.S. service members came in, they were assigned a subsequent year of Operation Iraqi Freedom. So we were the first National Guard unit from Kansas to deploy to combat since the Vietnam War. So at the time, the idea of deploying the National Guard unit was really pretty groundbreaking. It had not happened, really not happened. But today it's quite common that National Guard units are deploying overseas. In that picture, you'll see on my right here, that's Mark McLeod, Lieutenant McLeod. He was a program manager for a firm in Kansas City. And on my right, Lieutenant Schmidt, who is an information technology consultant with Sprint. So this is sort of the weird dynamic of a National Guard, right? We all had civilian jobs and worked a daily job, either as a program analyst or a curator. For about 15 months, we served a very different job in which we were deployed overseas. At the time, our ages ranged from 25 to 30. So why tell these stories about Iraq and Afghanistan? So 2021 marks the 20th anniversary of September 11th, which was the event that really kind of led to these conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. And much of that story kind of remains untold and fading from memory. They were some of the longest wars in American history. They shaped a generation of veterans that were part of civil society at the time, or are actually in the process of transferring back to civil society. And we hope you will engage veterans in telling their story. Today, we're going to review a few key moments from these events, really to just give you a framework and reference point when you're having conversations with these veterans. We'll discuss a few methods for sparking these conversations. And just know that these conflicts were deep and had lasting impact. They meant different things to different people, and people interpreted them in different ways. So we don't always agree on what they meant or what the outcomes were. We do just ask people to be respectful of the others in the room. So I am a retired major, served in the Kansas Army National Guard for about 22 years. I was assigned to units in Paola, Hiawatha, Wichita, and Manhattan. I deployed overseas 3 times, once to Iraq in 2003, to Egypt in 2009, and to Germany in 2016. During my deployment to Iraq, my unit provided base defense to U.S. Special Forces at the Baghdad International Airport. So when we say base defense, that really means we just ran guard towers and gates to provide security for those special forces. Additionally, I have 2 brothers, a sister, and a nephew that serve in the U.S. Army. 3 of us deployed to Iraq. So from 2003 to 2007, my parents had at least 1 child serving in Iraq. And I often like to joke with my mom that she has quite a substantial investment in the democracy of Iraq. She really doesn't think it's all that fun. Though I didn't realize it at the time, my deployment to Iraq really largely shaped the rest of my life. The deployment has come to be a waypoint in my life experience, with most of my memories sort of organized in pre-Iraq deployment and post-Iraq deployment. While in Baghdad, I met this gentleman. This is Ahmed. He was educated in Iraq as an engineer. He was part of the Southern Shia resistance to Saddam Hussein in Basra. He fought with U.S. Special Forces during the invasion and provided security at the same camp that I was at. And that's how we got to know each other, worked with each other every day. He was a father of 3 children, and he constantly asked me about a place called Kansas and what it was like to live in a democracy. Which is a really hard question to think about when you're a 25-year-old kid who had never lived anywhere outside of a democracy. And I think that's a part in my life when I realized that the rest of the world lives in a very different circumstance and conditions than we may live here. In this picture, I convinced him to wear a t-shirt from my hometown. I'm originally from Tipton, Kansas, in north central Kansas. And he was more than excited to wear this t-shirt. He was thrilled to do it. that's a little bit about Ahmed. In 2018, I coordinated, when I was working at Humanities Kansas, I coordinated the Kansas Stories of the Vietnam War, which was a statewide oral history project to commemorate the 60th anniversary of that conflict. So 2018 may seem an odd year to do that commemoration. It's kind of difficult to determine exactly when the conflict of Vietnam began. But in 1968 was the year in which there was the largest amount of US forces in Vietnam. That's often considered a good time to kind of commemorate the actions of that event. So while doing that oral history project, I came to realize three things. Telling your story can be a powerful way to deal with buried emotions and pay respect to your brothers and sisters in combat. The American public often has an unclear understanding of these wars, but there is a desire to learn more. And memories fade. So now is the time to capture and document these stories from Iraq and Afghanistan. Additionally, memories also sometimes become confused with popular perceptions of these conflicts. They sort of become melded together with one story that may not be exactly how events played out. So let's talk a little bit about post 9/11 veterans. And when I say post 9/11 veterans, I'm primarily referencing those who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. However, there were minor operations that occurred around the globe during that same period. I think it's useful to kind of provide a reference point for some of this data. So you'll see on the board there, I list information about the post 9/11 conflicts and provide some information regarding World War II. So post 9/11 conflicts was a 20-year period. Between 1.9 million and 3 million US service members served in post 9/11 operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Over half of those deployed more than once. 6,800 US service members died because of those conflicts. Approximately 0.7% of the American population serves in the military today. And if we take a look at World War II, which was a 4-year conflict, 16 million service members served during World War II. 405 US service members died or were casualties. And at that time, 11% of the American population served in World War II. So I think it's interesting to note that 0.7% number you'll see right here. That 0.7% of the Americans that serve today, a large portion of those actually come from what we would call military families. So there may be multiple members of any one family serving at any time. There may be brothers serving. There may be a father and a son sometimes serving, or an uncle and a niece, multiple generations. So curious, of that 0.7%, we look at that, we compare that to 11% that served during World War II. That's a significantly lower number during the post 9/11 conflicts. Any idea why the percentage may be lower now than it was during World War II? Any thoughts? Yes?
No draft.
No draft. That's really probably the primary reason. During World War II, we had instituted a draft, so individuals were mandated to serve. Today is different. Today we rely on an all-volunteer force. That's generally considered more advantageous, as that's a professional force in which individuals have mostly opted in there and to be part of that force, which is different than a draft. But while the idea of the all-volunteer force is advantageous, there are some general concerns about the equity of something like an all-volunteer force. For one thing, it's increasingly sort of concentrated on those military families, and it often receives negative perspective because it can draw primarily from the economically disadvantaged. So one of the primary incentives for recruiting individuals to serve is education, right? Is to provide the resources for your college education. That's really only appealing to a certain group of people who have a need for those education resources. In other words, if you're someone who has the resources to secure your education, you are less inclined to join or to enlist in the military. So you go to war with the army you have, not the army you might want or wish to have at a later date. That's a fairly famous quote by Donald Rumsfeld, who was the US Secretary of Defense in 2004. Does anybody remember that quote? Do you remember what that might be in reference to? So Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, while touring Iraq in 2004, which was just 2 years after we invaded in 2002, provided this response to a US soldier that was asking why the Army lacked vehicles with additional armor capable of deflecting roadside explosives. So during the Iraq conflict, one of the techniques that the enemy had used was to place improvised explosive devices, which are really just roadside bombs along roads to disable US military vehicles as they moved. And they were used quite frequently, and it was really problematic. But one way to mitigate that was to add armor to those vehicles, armor capable of deflecting that. But that was a slow process that began only after the invasion that they began adding that armor. And I always think that's an interesting question because that was essentially at a press conference. And if you've ever seen a press conference in a war zone involving the Secretary of Defense, those are usually very scripted, right? No one's asking questions that are going to be problematic. But in this instance, this individual asked a pretty challenging question. And the response that the Secretary of Defense gave was essentially, we didn't know, right? We went into this, we didn't really know we would need these resources, and we're slowly trying to get there. So most evidence actually indicates that the US really had no plans to invade Iraq prior to September 11th, and had really not even considered it as an option until well into 2002, almost a year after the September 11th attacks. Just want to quickly go over the geography, because I think sometimes we hear these words like the Middle East, we assume we know what those are, and sometimes we don't exactly know what that is. So you can see here, this post 9/11 conflicts largely occurred in a region that's known as the Middle East. This is a geopolitical region, approximately 18 countries that connects Asia to Africa to Europe. The most populous countries are Egypt, Iran, Iran and Turkey. Those are the most populated regions. The largest by land area is Saudi Arabia. The climate is generally hot, except for some cold mountainous regions in Afghanistan. Significant rivers include the Nile that flows through Egypt, and the Tigris and the Euphrates, which sit here, which flow through Iraq. And actually, interesting, where the rivers connect, really this valley is known as the Fertile Crescent. So that was the region in the world where we saw some of the earliest mass farming and large-scale civilizations. Significant bodies of water in the Red Sea flowing along Egypt here, and the Persian Gulf. Most of the countries around the Persian Gulf maintains vast reserves of what? Oil. For years, oil was the primary economic engine for the region, and it provided the global supply of what was really relatively cheap oil. Oil extraction in the Middle East began in earnest in the 1950s by British companies, and continues today mainly in Saudi Arabia and those Gulf states. So I just want to note, you'll see right here, you can see is where Baghdad, which is the capital of Iraq, is located, and in Afghanistan, you'll see Kabul located on the eastern side of the country. Also of note, we'll talk a little bit about the tiny country of Kuwait here, right, which sits in proximity to Iraq. So as I think about the post 9/11 conflicts, I try to determine what were the origins of these conflicts, right? And it's really kind of difficult to determine, but probably a good starting point is the Persian Gulf War that occurred in the 1990s. So in August 1990, Iraq, at the direction of President Saddam Hussein, invaded the nearby country of Kuwait. Generally, an unprovoked invasion of a sovereign country is kind of considered a regionally, if not globally, destabilizing event. It's really a concern to many countries when one country invades another for no clear purpose. And Saddam Hussein actually argued that the invasion was legitimate, as Kuwait was once part of Iraq. However, most sort of attribute his invasion of Iraq to efforts to eliminate some sovereign debt that was owed to the country of Kuwait. Iraq had borrowed a significant amount of money from Kuwait in an earlier conflict in which it was at war with Iran. So you can really see a really weird linkage of events between the Iran-Iraq War, the Persian Gulf War, and would later manifest as some of the post-9/11 conflicts. In January 1991, US President George Herbert Walker Bush led a multinational coalition to remove Iraqi presence from Kuwait. In February of 1991, that coalition pushed Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, actually crossed the border and just entered Kuwait, and then stopped and halted. Coalition determined that the objectives were met, and it did not advance onward to the capital of Baghdad. Saddam Hussein was left in power, and dissenters in Iraq, those who supported US military operations, really faced pretty brutal oppression after that. So President Bush often faced criticism for not going onward into Baghdad. Just curious if the group, if you have any thoughts of why President Bush made that decision. If you think of yourself as the president or those advising the president, why did somebody advise him, do not continue on? Didn't want another Vietnam started, right? The idea of a prolonged conflict that would involve a lot of resources was probably definitely one thing he was considering. Any other thoughts? So the Bush administration faced immediate criticism for not advancing to Baghdad and for allowing Saddam Hussein to remain in power. Bush argued that the coalition was built on a limited objective. Their objective was to liberate Kuwait, and that any further action would have fractured the coalition or the alliance. George Herbert Walker Bush was a former ambassador to the UN. He was a coalition builder. He felt it was important to go into this conflict with other countries, that the US would never go at this alone. So the idea of actually invading an Arab state became very concerning to other members of that coalition, such as Saudi Arabia, who were Arab states themselves. They could not sign on to a project that would lead to the US forces invading another Arab state. So they would not proceed, or it would have fractured the alliance. And that's what President Bush was very concerned about. Even at the time, then Secretary of Defense Cheney actually concurred with Bush. He expressed concern that additional casualties would be significant and suggested that the US would become bogged down with occupying and governing Iraq. And in some ways, we actually know exactly how that would play out, because we'd actually do that in the next coming years. So when thinking about the origins of these conflicts, you really can't think about them without considering the September 11th attacks, which occurred just 10 years after the Persian Gulf War. September 11th, 2001, terrorists flew hijacked airliners into the Trade Center and the Pentagon, which resulted in 2,977 fatalities. These terrorists were part of Al-Qaeda, which was a militant Islamic extremist network led by Osama bin Laden. And it's believed at the time that the attacks were planned by terrorists in Afghanistan, where the ruling Taliban government had harbored that Al-Qaeda network and had supported bin Laden. So this was very concerning to the US that this attack was executed by entities in another country, or that were being harbored by another country. So you can see here's a graphic. We kind of remember this graphic of the World Trade Center and the planes flying into it. It's really, undoubtedly, was shocking at the time. Even to look at this image, these images today, is really pretty shocking to know to think how this happened. Although I would argue it's somewhat uniquely threatening to us. Anybody have any thoughts on why the September 11th attacks were uniquely threatening to us? Sorry, what's that, sir?
First time what we got did
Right, so it was an attack that occurred on American soil, which was really shocking, right? Certainly, even up to this point, we had US military installations, the Khobar Towers, places in Saudi Arabia where terrorist attacks occurred, or even naval ships that may have been attacked by local terrorist entities, but certainly not on US territory. I heard someone else voice something. Oh, yeah. So really alarming that it happened on US territory. So 9/11 was uniquely threatening because it was an international threat that utilized our open culture, i.e. our ability to board planes and our freedom of movement and our ability to travel around the country or globe relatively unfettered. It used that open culture to take action on American soil with the intent of instilling fear to alter the American way of life. It seemed entirely possible, in addition to that, that further attacks could occur. Even on the day of September 11th, there were reports that sporadically came in about threats in other parts of the country. Some were even concerned that attacks would continue as the sun rose across the American West. And that fear of further attacks was really a primary motivator for the administration, as we began to see some of these post 9/11 conflicts. Their key objective was to prevent any further attacks on American soil. And because of our open culture, that's really difficult to implement that policy in the US, and perhaps better was to eliminate the threat overseas in the country in which it was developed. Even just days after the September 11th attack, we actually had a terrorist event occurring with anthrax letters being mailed to US senators that led to the fatality of a couple of US postal workers. We would later learn that that in fact was not a terrorist cell that did that, and that was likely the result of a US contractor working on an anthrax program and was worried about the program being eliminated. I hear you, rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked down these buildings will hear all of us soon. That was a quote from President George W. Bush on September 21st, 2001. Does anybody remember where President Bush was when he made these comments? Ground Zero. He was actually standing on the rubble of the World Trade Center. It's known as the bullhorn moment. So this was an ad hoc comment that was made by President Bush while standing atop the World Trade Center rubble just days after the 9/11 attacks. And I think it's interesting because the statement kind of combines two powerful sentiments. One was a consoling message that spoke to the rare political and social unity at the time. There was this unusual brief moment in which everybody was experiencing things the same way, and we all had a common bonding reaction. So that's the first part. I hear you, the rest of the world hears you. But the second part, and the people who knocked these buildings down hear all of us soon. That's different. That's sort of a declaration of pending retribution, almost indicating that plans were already in motion. Certainly, the president had been party to briefings and requested and providing authorizations for certain action at this time, and was likely well aware that we were formulating plans to invade Afghanistan. So President Bush was the former governor of Texas. He was the son of a powerful political family that included a president. George W. Bush was elected in 1999. The September attacks occurred just 8 months into his first term. Their related conflicts would largely dominate the remaining 7 years of his presidency and the terms of the next 3 presidents. Let's talk briefly about the war in Afghanistan. On October 7, 2001, in response to the September 11th attacks, the US led a multinational coalition to invade Afghanistan with the following objectives. One would be to end the Taliban rule. Remember, they were harboring terrorist cells. Another was to destroy the terrorist training camps. And the third was to capture those Al-Qaeda leaders. So the Taliban and Al-Qaeda leaders were mostly expelled. However, bin Laden and a few others did simply relocate to nearby Pakistan. It wasn't exactly clear where he was located at the time. We would later learn that he was in nearby Pakistan. So at a certain point, that coalition mission changed, right? The objectives, as I said, was to end Taliban rule. We had done that. The objective was to destroy the terrorist training camps. We had done that. And the goal was to capture Al-Qaeda leaders. We had largely captured them or expelled them in the country. However, we would remain there for another long period of time. And why was it? So the mission changed. Largely changed to support a new democratic Afghan government and prevent harboring of terrorists. The concern was, once we had evaded and eliminated those objectives, that if the coalition left, those entities would simply return and the terrorist operations would continue. So the goal became to establish a democratic state, so rebuild the institutions of state and train a new Afghan army. There was resistance to that coalition that emerged. Some in the country of Afghanistan were not supportive of this idea of the US remaining there for the new country, and an insurgency ensued for the next 20 years. This was actually part of a large effort for the US at the time that was known as the Global War on Terrorism. Essentially, we had promised that we would eliminate terrorism anywhere in the globe that it emerged, or we would support allies in eliminating those terrorist cells. Here you can see a picture. This is US service members firing artillery on Taliban positions on October 22nd, 2008 from Camp Blessing in eastern Afghanistan. I put this picture up there mainly because when we think of conflicts in the Middle East, we often think of a desert environment, a flat, hot desert environment. And in Afghanistan, it was quite different. Much of the combat in Afghanistan occurred in mountainous regions with small forward operating bases. And you can actually see, this is a base, there's probably about 15 guys there. This base is probably maybe less than an acre, and they would be assigned there for periods for several months or several weeks and might rotate out there periodically. These were located in the mountains. You can see this is actually right adjacent to a small Afghan village. That was also very common, that the forward operating base might be near a civilian, a small civilian center. Let's talk a little bit about the war in Iraq, right? On March 20th, 2003, using rationale that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, or WMD, the US led a rapid invasion of Iraq. Even at the time, some expressed concern about this opening of an Iraq conflict. While it was justified as sort of part of that global war on terrorism, there were some that argued that this actually distracted from the war on terrorism. There was no clear evidence necessarily that Saddam Hussein was part of the September 11th attacks. But for many, there was just general concern that Saddam Hussein had animosity to the US. He had capabilities to build some of these weapons. So it was really perhaps just a matter of time before he would be find common ground with those terrorist cells. But some were worried that this was actually taking resources away from the fight against terrorism, expanding the conflict to something much larger than originally intended. So some of those objectives in that Iraq war were to end Saddam Hussein's regime, eliminate Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, secure Iraqi oil fields, and enable a representative self-government. So most of those objectives kind of make sense to me, and they sound pretty common, right? Got to end the bad guys regime. We got to eliminate those weapons of mass destruction. Can't have those floating around. And we have to enable representative self-government. That's often something we do. The one that's different on here is secure Iraq's oil fields. I think that's traditionally seen as they wanted to secure that Iraq's oil field because that's what would guarantee the financial stability of Iraq moving forward. Or that was just a general concern for the West, right? It was to make sure we secure those oil fields. On December 13, 2003, Saddam was actually captured, later tried in Iraqi court and executed. However, we would remain in Iraq for another 8 years. The US occupation exacerbated tensions between already socio-religious groups like the Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish groups. And that largely resulted in an insurgency also in the country of Iraq. So this image here was a fairly famous image at the time. This is a picture of Marine Lieutenant Tim McLaughlin. He was given this flag by Senator Chuck Schumer for his aid to victims on September 11th. So he was actually in Lower Manhattan on September 11th, helping with the response to the September 11th attacks. And the U.S. Senator from New York, Chuck Schumer, gave him this flag to recognize his work. McLaughlin brought that flag to Iraq, and on April 9th, 2003, the flag was draped on a statue of Saddam Hussein as U.S. forces seized the city of Baghdad. The image went viral pretty quickly. Shortly after this shot, it was replaced with an Iraqi flag. Any idea why this image might have went viral, and what was the concern related to this image? Any thoughts? Well, for many, the idea of a U.S. service member hanging and draping a U.S. flag over the Saddam Hussein sort of tantamount or equal U.S. occupation of Iraq, right? And for the administration, that was not the image they wanted to project. Rather than occupying or invading Iraq, the argument was that the U.S. was liberating Iraq. We were there just to help the Iraqi people, to liberate them from oppression, set up a new government, and we would be on our way. The idea of hanging a U.S. flag over Saddam Hussein implied conquest, that we were there to take that land. And in fact, that's how it was referenced. When the image began to circulate, it was often used as a way to depict U.S. conquest of Iraq. In 2013, the National Marine Corps Museum in Virginia actually contacted Lieutenant McLaughlin and requested to display the flag at an exhibit because it had become fairly famous. He actually declined that offer. He felt it had unintentionally become a political image, right? It was not his intent. When he brought his flag there that he got from the U.S. Senator and hung on the statue, it was not his intent that that be co-opted into a political message. And he actually had felt bad from that point on. So he declined it being included in this exhibit, and that flag remains locked in his safety deposit box to this day. So let's talk a little bit about the end of the wars. Iraq in 2006, an Iraqi survey group traveled the country, spoke to many of the leaders, assessed the situation, and actually determined that the situation was grave and deteriorating, right? It was actually in worse conditions than it had been just a few years earlier. President Bush announced a surge, which meant that they would be adding 20,000 soldiers, and at the same time, he began with withdrawal discussions. 2011, a formal withdrawal occurred. And today we see in the aftermath, we certainly saw a period in 2014 in which some of those terrorist elements did return as ISIS, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. U.S. forces actually had to return to Iraq briefly to help resist or quell that issue. And some U.S. military service members remain today. However, Iraq does have a tenuous democracy today, right? Iraq holds regular elections, and the country's various religious and ethnic groups enjoy some representation in that political system. However, there is just some democratic governance concerns, often related to corruption and ongoing security threats. In Afghanistan, in 2011, bin Laden was located and killed. However, we would remain there for another 10 years. In 2018, U.S. began secret peace negotiations with the Taliban, actually excluding the Afghan government, right? When I talked about the mission to change, we were there to support the Afghan government. By this point, we were having peace negotiations and excluded that government from those negotiations. On September 20th, 2021, U.S. withdrew the final 640 service members. And you'll remember these were fairly dramatic images of the evacuation of U.S. allied Afghanis out of the country. And certainly that is a dramatic image, but I would note by that time, really it was the last 640 U.S. service members that were getting out. By this point in 2000 and 2021, the vast majority of US military forces have left the country for some time. In Afghanistan, in the aftermath of that, we would actually see the Taliban return. They did return. That is the governing authority today in Afghanistan. So what were unique about the post 9/11 conflicts? So as I think through this, I often think these are unique, but sometimes when I read back through some of previous conflicts like Vietnam and others, realize that sometimes these are the same issues that come up for every US conflict. One of them is the limited force. So throughout both conflicts, both Iraq and Afghanistan, US policy limited the size of the force to the minimal amount necessary to accomplish the mission. So rather than substantially grow the size of the US Army, planners had to rely on existing soldiers available. So rather than committing resources to recruit that larger volunteer force or to implement a draft, a regular rotation of existing units was implemented. So an active duty unit could expect to deploy every 2 years, while a reserve or National Guard unit would deploy every 5 to 6 years. Right? By this time, we have a system of moving National Guard reserve units every 5 to 6 years. And you'll remember, like I said earlier, prior to these conflicts, it was rare or almost never happened that a National Guard unit was deployed. So this rotation often resulted in numerous deployments for any one individual as they moved new units. And of note for National Guard units, this often meant deploying the communities, sometimes their sole worker or the county sheriff might be gone for 12 months. We also saw what we call a counterinsurgency warfare, and that's defined as military actions taken against irregular forces. So rather than large land battles between two national armies, counterinsurgencies involve a conflict unidentified combatants moving through the civilian population. US forces had to establish a vast network of large bases and forward operating stations, each of one of them surrounded a civilian population that may or may not harbor enemy combatants. The challenge was to win the hearts and minds of those civilian populations so they would actually report or expel those terrorists in those communities. We also saw reliance on locals. So in both conflicts, withdrawal was contingent on establishing functional democratic governments. This required the training of new national armories or other institutions of democracy to assume operations which would allow the US to lead. To win the hearts and minds, US forces employed locals to provide basic services. Additionally, locals were used as interpreters. This resulted in unusually strong bonds between US service members with the locals, while oddly at the same time, there was general concern of disloyalty and corruption among those locals. And it's worth noting that those locals that supported the US military often faced unique threats of their own. Their families, while they might be on a US base working for the US military or coalition, their families resided at home, and it was not difficult for the terrorists to determine who those were. We also saw advanced medical treatment. So medical treatment of the wounded had advanced substantially since World War II or the Vietnam War. Rather than death, post 9/11 veterans often healed from their immediate physical injury. However, this often resulted in a more immediate return to the battle and increased the percentage of those maimed or surviving with permanent injury or loss of appendage. We also saw the use of embedded reporters. Does anybody remember that concept of embedded reporters? You may remember what that meant. Traveled with them. Reporters actually traveled with the US military members, right? The Department of Defense adopted a new method for interacting with the media during these conflicts. Rather than deny media access to combat, as was the case in previous wars, reporters were embedded. This meant that they were provided seemingly unfettered access by living among US service members. For even at the time, there were some that questioned whether this created a problem for objectivity among the media. Media members were living with, working with US military service members, creating strong bonds. They actually relied on US service members for their security and for their food. So there was a concern that they would not retain their objectivity when reporting. There was also new digital forms of communication, such as email, social media, video conferencing, that allowed service members to communicate with family members immediately and more frequently. However, these digital forms really don't lend themselves to long-term preservation, right? It's easy to keep a letter at home that was handwritten, that's easy to retain, but an email that's sent home or a social media message, a message on Facebook, is much more difficult to preserve. So fewer letters home really means that we have less written record of the service members' experience. In aggregate, we probably have a better written record of service members' experience from perhaps World War II or Vietnam, where those letters were actually sent home and retained, than we do of these post 9/11 conflicts, where it may have been a digital message or email that was sent home that was long deleted. So this is a photo of Lieutenant Dan Bleckert from across Georgia. He had one leg blown off as well as part of the other foot when a bomb exploded under his Humvee in Iraq in 2008. So advancements in prosthetics and artificial limbs, you'll see he has a prosthetic here, and there's actually some prosthetic features on his other leg. Advancements in prosthetics or artificial limbs actually allowed Bleckert to return to combat in 2010. So within 2 years of losing his leg, he was actually back in the fight. So one might, while that would appear to be a good thing, and this was actually at the request of the soldier, really, he really wanted to get back to the conflict because he felt like that was his role. I think it's reasonable to ask, is that a good decision, right? For someone who's experienced that type of trauma to put them relatively quickly back into the fight. So what exactly does it mean to be a post 9/11 veteran? So 1 in 5 veterans today served after September 11. Their experience is markedly different than those of previous generations. A Pew Charitable Trust study from 2019 found that 57% of combat veterans say they witnessed someone in their unit either wounded or killed. 61% report trouble paying their bills, and 41% were struggling with alcohol and substance abuse. In 2021, Brown University estimated that the total cost of caring for post 9/11 veterans at $2.5 trillion, which includes the disability and medical care for the next 50 years. And I think that's an important number for a couple different reasons. I think often when we plan these operations or we consider these invasions, I think it's very standard that there's an estimate that's done on what that invasion will cost. And I think that often includes costs of getting vehicles and equipment to another country, the cost of service members, their salary and wages while they're there. I don't think that estimate often includes this amount of caring for those soldiers for the next 50 years, which certainly should be a consideration. Suicide rate among US veterans is greater than the general population. The study from Brown University in 2021 indicates that 7 suicides per day occur among veterans. For post 9/11 veterans, this is often attributed to traumatic brain injury resulting from improvised explosive devices. We talked about this earlier. They often went off along the roadsides. Individuals in the vehicle would be jostled and be subject to some brain injury. There was exposure to stress related to multiple deployments, and advanced medical treatment resulting in an increased likelihood to return to service. And veterans have often cited the American public's limited understanding of those conflicts. It was somewhat jarring. Veterans would report that they would be in Iraq and Afghanistan, involved in these fights, come home on leave, and they'd see an American public that was often not all that knowledgeable on the conflicts themselves. So why is it important to tell these stories? The act of telling one story or communicating an experience can be a powerful tool. For the teller, it gives them a feeling of empowerment and provides a type of therapy by reflecting on your experience. For the listener, it can demonstrate appreciation, allow for a greater understanding of a loved one's motivations. Telling one story can occur in many formats. It can be as simple as an informal conversation among friends or even acquaintances, or it can be a more formal oral history interview that preserves valuable information, research that could inform future decision makers. But for some, engaging conversations with veterans about their experiencing can be intimidating, and I can understand that. During the stories of the Vietnam War, which was that oral history project I had talked about earlier, we often heard from family members that service members never talked about their experience. The service member often stated, "No one ever asked. I just wanted to move on. I didn't want to burden anyone, or they wouldn't understand." So a desire to move on is valid, and I think sometimes even kind of prematurely commended, right? We might be impressed when somebody is able to come back from a military deployment and just get right back into what they were doing. But military service overseas away from family is disruptive, no matter what the role, and leaves deep impressions. Studies indicate unresolved or unaddressed emotional issues can manifest later in life in unrecognized ways. So the veteran may not even understand why they're occurring. And they can range from insomnia to marital tension to substance abuse. Concern that others will not understand is valid and probably correct in most instances. However, I like to think this affords an opportunity for citizens to research and gain understanding about conflicts, maybe show up to talks like you guys are today. So I want to give a couple tips maybe on how to conduct some of those informal conversations. Like I talked about earlier, it can be an intimidating thing to do. So kind of base this on some of my personal experience and conversations with colleagues about what are some good ways to engage in those informal conversations with veterans. So here are some do's and don'ts. Every veteran experiences things different. This may work for some and may not for others, but do just start a conversation. Good starter questions might be, did you serve in the military? Where were you stationed or where were you assigned? You might have time for deeper questions. You might ask the veteran if they have a moment to talk a bit more. You might ask them, how long did you serve? What type of work did you do in the military? This is called a military occupational specialties, or MOS. Everybody has a specialty that they are trained in and they're knowledgeable on, and they're often very happy to talk about it. Did you go anywhere interesting? Did you have family members that served? Because they often do. Veterans love acronyms, such as MOS or PCS. By all means, ask them what that acronym means. They'll be excited to tell you what that acronym means. Just manage your feelings as they come up while you're talking to the veteran, right? Their stories can be impactful and powerful, but you want to try to manage your emotions as you're having those conversations. Thanking veterans for their service is kind. It is a kind thing to do, but I sometimes think a brief conversation might be more meaningful than just saying thank you for your service. So some don'ts, I would recommend, don't immediately express your opinions on war or how veterans should be treated or shift to conversations on politics. Those are certainly important conversations, but they can happen at a later point. Don't immediately jump off of conversations of politics. Relating stories of a veteran in your life is fine, but avoid dominating the conversation with the accomplishments or service members in your family, right? I've been part of these conversations where somebody asks about me, and then proceeds to tell me all about the amazing things that everyone in their family did. And that's wonderful, and that is good. It's just not really a conversation about the veteran anymore. Don't assume that women served only certain roles. Sometimes we make the assumption that women served as only nurses or something like that. I can tell you I deployed 3 times. The time I deployed, I had women in my unit and they did the exact same job that I did. Don't ask if the veteran ever killed anyone. I know that seems like a shocking question, but I've had that question. And I actually kind of understand where this comes from. I think this is kind of related to the way we depict war in fiction and in movie. And in those scenarios, it's often something prideful to have done something like that. I can tell you that's a very personal experience. It really just not something I think most people would want to share. You don't have to explain why you didn't serve. People don't serve for a variety of reasons, some of which are well beyond their control. I've been in conversations where people have to immediately tell me why they didn't serve. You don't have to justify that to the veteran, right? That's your business. Avoid asking the veteran if they were in combat, right? It implies that the experience of someone that didn't face combat is of less value. Rather ask them, did they deploy? Ask them what kind of missions they were involved in. Combat is defined many different ways. I can tell you I deployed with truck drivers, and most conflicts, right? Truck driving is not a dangerous role, but in these particular conflicts, moving supplies from one forward operating base to another along a road was a very dangerous scenario, right? And they were really subject to pretty extreme risk. I don't know that I would say that they were in combat, but regardless, they faced a significant risk. So I'll just briefly talk about oral histories with veterans. So we talked a little bit about what an informal conversation looks like. The other alternative is to do what's called a more formal oral history. Some do's for that is schedule time and share example interview questions with that veteran in advance so that they both have a good grasp of what you'll be asking, but maybe even have some responses prepared. Explain how the interview will be used and ask the veteran to sign a release or state permission in the recording itself, right? We just want to make sure everybody's dialed into that and to how this interview will be used. Find a quiet place to record and set up equipment in advance. There's actually several web-based applications for recording. Ensure your equipment is functioning. As I said, I was involved in some of these oral history projects, and you be the guy who gets 45 minutes into a really powerful interview before you discover that you forgot to turn on your equipment. Ask the veteran to bring pictures, uniforms, or objects. These are actually really powerful memory tools. The veteran can describe to you. You ask them to explain what's in the picture, and it can really help reconstruct that memory for them. Transcribe the interviews afterwards. So what we mean by that is largely create a word written record of that interview, right? It's very time consuming, but it's very important because even that oral interview technology changes, the format in which that is recording changes. Sometimes those become less readable or less audible, the recording, but the written record will remain long after that audible recording is gone. And that's the resource that researchers will use in the future. Provide a copy of the interview to the veteran afterwards. Some don'ts, unless necessary, generally avoid interviewing the veteran with family members present. And I know that sounds odd, but we found even in the oral history project that we did, that a veteran will tell one set of stories when their spouse is there, and they'll tell a different set of stories when the spouse is not there. Sometimes that is because the veteran wants to protect the spouse from some of the stories that they may have. So it's often a better idea to interview that veteran without the spouse present. Avoid asking about aspects in which the veteran does not have firsthand knowledge. So when we did this Vietnam Veterans Oral History Project, inevitably, we worked with a lot of communities that were doing these interviews. Inevitably, there was always a question came up to Vietnam veterans for their opinions on Jane Fonda. which was, if you'll know, Jane Fonda during Vietnam War, she traveled to North Vietnam, which was really shocking at the time. Lots of issues with that, but the problem was, if they would ask Vietnam veterans who were not there, did not see Jane Fonda visit, they really had no insights into Jane Fonda. Ultimately, the best that they could provide was really sort of their opinion or thoughts about that matter, that they may have concluded years later after that visit. They didn't have firsthand knowledge, so avoid asking them to provide answers on things they may have never been able to see. Don't assume you can edit out noises when you're doing these recordings. So you want to find a quiet place. We like to think that we have a lot of technology today that we can edit out those noises. Ultimately, you really can't. It's pretty difficult to do. Don't forget to ask the veteran to state their name, years of service, and service branch on the recording. It's really an essential piece of information that will be valuable to future researchers. Don't feel compelled to record lengthy conversations in one setting. Sometimes multiple settings are needed. Sometimes a veteran may not even know that they're about to discuss as much information as they are. But it can be quite exhausting when those interviews begin to go over an hour and a half. There's nothing wrong with breaking that into multiple interviews. All right, here's just quickly a list of some of the resources I had mentioned. There are some web-based apps that can be used for some of those oral history projects. The Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress really provides a nice resource for doing those oral history projects. They have a really impressive repository where you can listen to many of these oral history interviews. And there's also the StoryCorps app. Anybody familiar with StoryCorps? Yeah, this is a program on National Public Radio every Friday. They a really powerful clip from some of their oral history interviews, and it's really well done. So that kind of concludes what I wanted to talk about. So I'm going to open this up to questions. I'm curious to hear if anybody has any questions. Yeah, any thoughts, comments, feedback? Yes, sir.
Do you see any way at any time, at any point in the future, that we can eliminate a religious-based terrorist organization where the main objective is to die and get to heaven?
I would say no, right? I think that entity, religious-based organization or organization motivated by religion has existed for centuries, and I think they will probably exist for many centuries in the future. But I think it's a threat we would probably always have to deal with.
We just can't kill them.
Well, I don't know. Problem with that is that actually sometimes intensifies the threat, right? Now there's a martyrdom aspect to that, so sometimes that makes the situation worse.
They're making and putting together a history of post 9/11 veterans.
So there is, like I mentioned, the Veterans Oral History Project at the Library of Congress provides tools for individuals, family members, and others to record those oral history projects. I don't know that I would not say that is a concerted effort to capture post 9/11 veteran interviews. So I'm not aware of anybody that's actually intentionally doing that. I would argue for an institution that's interested in that, like now is sort of the time to do that, because we're approaching 20 years for many of those veterans, a 20-year distance from that experience. Inside of 20 years, I think sometimes veterans are really reluctant to talk about it. They probably just want to get on with their lives, but there's something about that 20-year period in which a veteran becomes reflective and probably has some better perspective to talk about that experience. So that's kind of the golden time. So I hope there's an institution interested in doing that.
Any other questions? We want to thank him, and I think one of the things we want to do is give him one of our loves and say,
oh, nice. Thank you. Thank you for being here today.